Muito boa tarde. Eu tenho a missão muito facilitada, mas antes de mais peço imensa desculpa pelo ligeiro atraso, até porque os organizadores, nos quais eu próprio me incluo, pediram-me muito que tivesse não só o controle do tempo, mas também o início dos trabalhos. Queria saudar o Francisco Seixas da Costa, que é o presidente do Clube de Lisboa, e em nome dele toda a organização e obviamente também aqui a Fundação Kaldor. Nesta sessão nós vamos ter dois oradores fundamentalmente. O Ivan Timofeev está aqui ao meu lado, ele é diretor de programas do Conselho dos Negócios Internacionais da Rússia, abreviadamente RIAC, e também diretor do Clube de Discussão Valdai. No primeiro, tem trabalhado com muitos diplomatas, funcionários de Estado, peritos e líderes das organizações não governamentais sobre a diplomacia e a política externa russa. Desde 2015, é também o responsável pelo programa sobre a segurança euroatlântica no referido Valdai, do Clube de Discussão Valdai. A Mary Kaldor é professora e diretora da Unidade de Investigação sobre Conflitos e Sociedade Civil no Departamento de Desenvolvimento Internacional do LSE. Foi membro fundador do Desarmamento Nuclear Europeu, é co-presidente da Assembleia de Cidadãos de Helsínquia e membro da Comissão Internacional Independente para a Investigação da Crise do Kosovo. Desenvolveu e continua a desenvolver o conceito de novas guerras e de sociedade civil global, e o seu trabalho sobre segurança humana influenciou diretamente e muito as políticas europeias. Está aqui também do meu lado esquerdo. Deste lado, a Ana Santos Pinto, que me vai ajudar após as intervenções no debate e ela própria conduzirá o debate. É professora auxiliar no Departamento de Estudos Políticos da Universidade Nova de Lisboa, investigadora do Instituto Português de Relações Internacionais, IPRI-NOVA, e investigadora no Instituto de Defesa Nacional. Anteriormente trabalhou como consultora na Iniciativa das Nações Unidas Aliança de Civilizações, assessora do Ministro da Defesa Nacional e assistente de investigação no Instituto de Estudos Estratégicos Internacionais, em Lisboa. Desenvolve a sua pesquisa sobre identidade na política internacional e assuntos de segurança, particularmente no que respeita à União Europeia, Médio Oriente e Norte da África. Eu dava de imediato a palavra ao Ivan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for a kind introduction. It's a great privilege and honor for me and pleasure to be here in Lisbon. I'm for the first time here, and maybe it's a sign of destiny that one of my next destinations is Vladivostok, which is on the other side of the continent. And I cannot avoid remembering the old idea of General de Gaulle, which was then revisited by Mikhail Gorbachev. I mean, the greater Europe and common security space from Lisbon to Vladivostok. So I'm sure that this event will fuel my, trip from one side of Eurasian continent to another. Our today's topic addresses several important and burning issues. I mean, the terrorism and the challenge of terrorism, the interconnection of terrorism and autocratic regimes, social roots of terrorism, and the overall state of security in our relations. And I will try to provide several thoughts from the Russian perspective on how it is more or less seen from Moscow, though I must admit that Moscow also contains lots of views. We have a huge competition inside the city and the country about the visions of what's going on, so I would present just one point of view. Well, it is a common knowledge that terrorism is our joint threat, that we need to cooperate and we need to be allies, and we need to move in a common direction when we speak about terrorism, regardless our political views and at some point regardless our national interests. So terrorism does not have nationalities or other, national attachments. So this is a universal problem. And if we look at our international efforts, we could see some progress and some success stories. For instance, just recently, in 2017, the United Nations Security Council has adopted Resolution 2353, which was voted by all of the members of Security Council, and providing more ground for fight with information propaganda from terrorist organizations and making other important steps. And this important resolution was preceded by other resolutions, by General Assembly, by Security Council. So if you look at the level of UN and UN as a universal international organization, things are not so bad as they could be. However, if you look at the field, if you look at the real politics and real relations between countries, between Russia and the United States, and between Russia and the West in general, between different regional powers, we would see a completely different story. Our cooperation on terrorism was significantly undermined after 2014, when the Ukrainian crisis started. There were strong ideas that terrorism and counterterrorism basket should be untouchable. It should not be affected by our contradictions and disagreements on other issues, even though these disagreements are hard. However, recent developments show that things are worse than they could be, and we failed to keep this counterterrorism basket untouchable. And Syrian example, Syrian case, what is going on now in Syria is quite an illustrative example. It was a great achievement that we managed to finally smash and destroy ISIS, at least ISIS infrastructure, though I wouldn't claim that ISIS is, let's say that ISIS is defeated, because we have ISIS now in Afghanistan. We have rebranding of this movement. We have new, let's say, sleeping cells, etc., etc. So it's too early to celebrate the victory. However, we managed to make a great deal. And what is important that, unfortunately, we did it in quite an uncoordinated manner. There was a US-led coalition, there is a US-led coalition, there is a coalition between government of Syria, I mean Assad government, and Russian forces. So the thing which must have been done as a joint action have been done as an quite uncoordinated action. And what we see now in the field in Syria is a result of this poor coordination and sometimes, let's say, a representation of the contradictions between the great powers. We have completely different narratives of terrorism. We have completely different understanding of what terrorism is. We regard in a different way different groups operating in Syria. For instance, Russians claim and blame Americans for supporting Jabhat al-Nusra, which is regarded by Moscow as a terrorist organization. Americans are blaming Russia for cooperation with Iran and Iranian cooperation with Hezbollah, which is considered to be a terrorist organization by Washington. And I can, I can provide these evidences of contradictions for the whole day, I think. So it's a great problem that we are failing to coordinate. We are failing to make a joint effort. Our interaction on the level of Russian NATO Council on counterterrorism is almost frozen. And at the same time, terrorists and extremists of different kinds are feeling good in this environment, in this contradictory environment. They are creating new brands. They are employing new information technologies. They're becoming very effective in cybersphere, in social networks. they are attracting new people, not just from the region, but from Europe also. So we are providing, paradoxically, quite a comfortable environment for terrorists and extremists of all the kinds. But what is more important is not just the contradictions between the great powers. It is a factor, it's a negative factor, but I propose to look at the problem in a more, let's say, fundamental way, in a more strategic way. Because what we should do is to look at least 3 different factors beyond political contradiction. Because at some level, well, great powers and countries can agree. But there are more fundamental factors which are, let's say, more objective to us. The first factor is the state consistency and the crisis of state in the Middle East and beyond. So the rise of terrorism and extremism happened after the collapse of several regimes, and here we attach this correlation between regime change and terrorism. And the paradox was, and one of the topics of this conference is development. The paradox was that if you look at the statistics, if you look at the quality of life statistics of the countries which collapsed, I mean Libya, I mean Syria, I mean several others, you will find that their social indicators were on the rise. The level of education was growing up, GDP per capita was growing up. So the theory which implies that revolution is the result of poverty did not work. Of course, there were social conflicts, conflicts around water, etc. But all in all, we got revolutions in the countries which faced growing quality of life. Syria used to be quite a well-off country. Still, we got a brutal revolution there, brutal civil war, and a comfortable environment for terrorism and extremism. And the process of the crisis of the secular state, secular autocratic state, has not yet ended. So we will have, there is a probability that we will have some more, taking into account that it may be also spurred by a global spasm, which was mentioned by George Friedman in the previous session. Another factor, I will be brief, another factor is ideology. It seems that we are losing an ideological fight with radicals and extremists. If you look at those people who are joining extremists, these are, of course, some of them are from poor families, from socially underdeveloped places, but many of them are from prosperous families. Many of them are from well-off families, from the families of migrants, for instance, of the third wave. So these are the people who would never be suspected to be, let's say, potential victims of terrorist recruitment. And that's another challenge. I mean, our ideology of enlightenment, and here I view Russia and Europe and the United States as the proponents of similar ideological values. The values of enlightenment, the values of rationality, the values of progress and rational order. We are under severe attack by completely different ideas, and there is still no remedy to counteract it. What is the remedy? Nationalism? Is it dangerous? Well, it may be effective in the short run, but what's about our integration processes? That's not only the problem of EU, that's also the problem of Russia with our integration process. And last but not least, I mean demography. If we look at the demographic dynamics, we will find different patterns. The countries which faced revolutions in the Middle East were and are still characterized by the so-called youth hill or youth curve, the huge representation of young people in the population, which is of course great and which is good. But what we mentioned in terms of development, it appeared that their educational level grew up, their welfare level grew up, but the political systems failed to satisfy their growing demands. and we got revolutions, we got the rise of radicalism, and we got the search for new ideological grounds by the youth and young population. So here are my principal points. The only thing I would like to conclude is the call for better coordinated action, despite political tensions and disagreements. I may find it idealistic here, but no progress is possible without idealists. Thanks.
Muito obrigado, Ivan, pela intervenção que teve, que seguramente suscitou e vai suscitar algumas dúvidas relativamente à assistência. Eu dava de imediato a palavra à Mary.
Trying to understand what you said. Gosh, well, we were asked a lot of questions for this session. And I thought I would start with where we left off in the last session, which is the transition that we're living through between the end of what we might call the American model of development, based on mass production and intensive use of oil, and the emergence of a new model of development which is largely based on the transformation brought about by information and communications technologies. It was Gramsci who said in the 1930s, Antonio Gramsci, the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, we observe many morbid symptoms. I may have got the quote a bit wrong. So the issues that we're now discussing, terrorism, conflict, authoritarianism, are all, I think, the morbid symptoms of transition. I think we have, rather like the transition of the 1920s and 30s, which Gramsci was talking about, we have this great sense of foreboding that something terrible is going to happen. Actually, I think something terrible is already happening. I think when you think about some of the things that are going on at the moment, refugees drowning in their thousands in the Mediterranean, the bombing of schools and hospitals in Yemen and Syria, the terrorists driving lorries into crowded places in Canada, of all places, or in France, or in Britain. Long-range assassinations, the drones campaign on, I would say, an industrial scale, which is would have been quite unthinkable a few years ago. The use of chemical weapons, nerve agents, beheading, torture, sexual slavery. I mean, all these phenomena by a whole range of parties are things that people of my generation believed would never happen again. So how do we make sense of it? I think in previous transitions of this kind, we had a major war. We had the Napoleonic Wars, we had the wars of the mid-19th century, and we had the wars of the 20th century, all of which ended rather decisively and brought about a restructuring both of the international order and of the nature of the state. Now, I think the problem we face, I'm not sure if it's a problem because those wars were really horrible. 70 million people died in the wars of the 20th century, is that I think military means just don't work any longer. And this isn't just because we have the threat of mass destruction. It's actually because the difference between very advanced military technology of the kind possessed by Russia and America is not so different from very primitive military technology, the improvised explosive devices of insurgents and terrorists, the box cutters of the flying airplanes into towers. And if you think about it, it's been 17 years since the war on terror was declared. And far from defeating terrorism, terrorism is a much greater problem than it was in 2001. We started with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and particularly in Iraq, this created a terrorism problem where none had existed previously. It was a theatre attracting jihadists from all over the world. More recently, we've had the Global Coalition Against ISIS, and although they have theoretically, they've taken the territory again, they have razed cities like Raqqa and Mosul to the ground. They're complete rubble. They've killed hundreds and thousands of civilians, literally hundreds of thousands of civilians, and ISIS is reappearing in the liberated areas. People in places like Raqqa, and in my research program we've talked to them, feel so much more upset by what the coalition has done because so many more people were killed than were killed by ISIS. And that's really troubling. And by the way, the same is true of Assad and the Russians. More than 95% of the casualties in the Syrian war, which are about 500,000, have been caused by Russian and Syrian bombing. And I think you can also make a similar argument about the classic geopolitical military responses to authoritarian regimes. When the West says, oh, we must be strong against Russia, that actually plays into Putin's hands. It strengthens his position domestically. We had a very good example recently in Britain with this nerve gas attack on 2 people in Salisbury. So Theresa May, our Prime Minister, immediately, she was probably right, blamed it on Russia, but she didn't have the evidence. Immediately, it decided to expel Russian diplomats. That resulted in tit-for-tat expulsions, the closure of the British consulate in St. Petersburg and the closure of the British Consul. Who gained from it? Well, Theresa May probably gained politically, and so did Putin. So it doesn't produce any answers, those approaches. I think what we face now, the thing that we're afraid of, our forebodings, is not a war like 20th century wars, but what I call a new war, which is what we're seeing in Syria and Libya. And these are very different kinds of wars. They are not so much deep-rooted political contests between two sides, which is what we think of as war. Rather, they're a kind of anarchic social condition in which literally hundreds of armed groups gain from violence itself rather than from winning or losing. They gain from violence because it's a way to mobilize political ideologies based on fear, extreme jihadism, for example. And they gain because they get revenue from loot, from pillage, from smuggling, from taxing humanitarian assistance. So we've created some very rich warlords. And these kinds of wars are very, very difficult to end. Clausewitz argued that classic wars tended to the extreme as each side tries to win. These kinds of wars tend to persistent as all the parties gain from a situation of violence. And so I'm less optimistic than George Friedman that this will be over in 15 to 20 years, because these kinds of wars tend to spread and they're very difficult to end. So what on earth do we do? Well, I think in this interdependent world, we need approaches that were traditionally considered domestic approaches rather than international approaches. We tend to think when we deal with problems domestically, we deal with them with law and politics and economic measures. When we deal with things internationally, it's either war or diplomacy. And I've given you reasons why the military approach doesn't work, but it's also true that diplomacy doesn't work very well either. You can't really negotiate with terrorists. How can you mediate among warlords? What kind of outcome are you going to get? Or how can you negotiate with criminal regimes? So diplomacy is also problematic. So we need an approach that is based on justice, political legitimacy, and socioeconomic measures. I don't have time to describe all these, but just let me say a few words. First of all, in terms of justice, just an example. 9/11 was treated by George Bush as an attack on the United States, as though the terrorists were a foreign state. Supposing instead he treated it as a crime against humanity, not an attack specifically against the United States, that would have required policing and intelligence response rather than a military response, which would have meant everything would have been very different. Similarly, I think, today's authoritarian regimes are largely based on criminalized oligarchies, and that's especially true since the financial crisis of 2008, when we've seen this enormous amount of wealth accruing to a small body of people, and we've seen the way states have become, many states, the deficit states, have become increasingly dependent on finance, oil revenues, rather than on taxation. They have become effectively rentier states. And if you think about both these autocratic regimes and these conflicts, they create a kind of environment in which you have to be a criminal in order to survive. It's systematic corruption. In conflict zones, you can't make a legitimate living. You have to either become a criminal or join an extremist militia if you're going to survive. So I think we also need to think about how you create legitimate economies. How do you reverse this kind of process? That's a second area. But finally, and most importantly, and that's in a big we need to reconstruct political legitimacy. On the one thing I agree with Timofeev is that it is the loss of legitimacy of states that is the huge problem, the pervasive mistrust in political institutions, which is what upholds a rule of law. Conflicts, I meant to say that, I mean, contemporary conflicts are fundamentally illegal, both in a war crime sense. They violate international humanitarian law because they involve the deliberate killing of civilians, they violate human rights law, and they violate economic regulations. So reconstructing political legitimacy from the ground up is sort of the key to reconstructing both economies and establishing systems of justice. And I think you do find areas, sort of, if you like, islands where political legitimacy does exist, particularly in conflict zones, and it's building on that is so important. But let me just make one final remark rather than going into this. How does this come about? How do you rebuild political legitimacy? Who's going to take a lead in all of this? I think many of the ideas that I've just now been put forward, you will find, for example, in UN documents on peace building. You will find them in the documents of the African Union and the European Union. I would point specifically to the European Union's global strategy, which was published, funnily enough, the day after the British referendum decision to leave the European Union. I think the EU, the European Union, is particularly important in this respect because it's the European Union that has most to lose from what's happening, particularly if you think about the wars in the Middle East. It's the problem of refugees, the problem of terrorism, the problem of organized crime. These are all affecting the European Union first and foremost, and yet, oddly enough, the European Union has been absolutely nowhere in any of these conflicts. What's more to the point, the European Union seems to be the only entity with the resources available for reconstruction. So I think actually trying to implement what's in the global strategy could be a very important starting point. And the problem here lies in what we were discussing earlier, the lack of political leadership. It's all there on paper. The European Union actually, and this is partly thanks to Brexit, is now building the tools that it needs to do it because the UK is no longer objecting. But actually it needs some political leadership from the European Union, and that's what we're lacking.
Muito obrigado, Mary, pela sua intervenção. Antes de dar a palavra de imediato à Ana, queria ter presente e queria recordar as intervenções iniciais na abertura desta conferência, quer por parte do Dr. Oliveira Martins, quer por parte do Francisco Seixas da Costa, quer por parte do Presidente da República, que relevaram a circunstância de nós vivermos hoje num mundo que já não é unipolar, deixou de ser bipolar, não é unipolar, e portanto as respostas, como agora a Mary referiu, relativamente à existência de uma estratégia global, não é fácil neste mundo cada vez mais multipolar e com uma série de interesses que se entrecruzam, como aliás neste painel é perguntado. Queria apenas fazer notar o seguinte: a contribuição hoje a nível multilateral não pode prescindir de ninguém. Independentemente de estarmos aqui em Lisboa, eu queria recordar de um apontamento que, aliás, a Mary agora referiu relativamente à África e à pressão que a situação demográfica em África e a situação socioeconómica determina relativamente à Europa e a pressão que os refugiados também têm com todo o cotejo de desumanidade que nós assistimos. Refiro isto pelo seguinte: ninguém pode estar de fora, e muito menos países que neste mundo global têm um peso que não é negligenciável e que não é obviamente o peso das armas nem o peso da força. Eu refiro-me concretamente aos países de língua oficial portuguesa e à importância que têm no Atlântico Sul. Esses países representam hoje no mundo a primeira língua mais falada do Atlântico Sul. E numa altura em que há também uma pressão enorme nos mares e na pirataria, não apenas na zona da Somália, mas neste momento já também na zona do Golfo da Guiné, e em muitos países que concorrem para que a comunidade internacional responda de forma positiva, como é o caso da República Centro-Africana, onde aliás Portugal está, esta defesa da estratégia global, sobretudo ao nível do Atlântico Sul, dificilmente pode prescindir do concurso de todos os países que falam português. Muito dificilmente. A menos que esta importância do ponto de vista de países e povos que têm uma concepção universalista e tolerante na forma de estarem e na defesa dos direitos humanos não seja relevante à escala global. A circunstância de nós estarmos aqui em Lisboa a promover esta iniciativa é um momento também muito importante para que haja um salto qualitativo da nossa parte deste mundo de fala portuguesa nesta afirmação à escala global e na estratégia que tem que ser pensada de respostas que não pertencem apenas aos grandes países que hoje têm uma relevância relativa dada a multilateralidade. E mesmo ao nível da própria Europa, que também foi aqui referido, isso deve estar muitíssimo presente. Não é por acaso que nós chegamos onde chegamos e onde neste momento podemos dar de facto todos um contributo muitíssimo relevante. Não há aqui nenhuma concepção, digamos, chauvinista da nossa parte ou invocável apenas pela presença significativa do que representamos à escala global, mas eu vejo que estão aqui também personalidades de países irmãos, quer do Brasil, quer de Angola, e não ficaria bem com a minha consciência se não desse esta referência. Posto isto, passava de imediato, porque se vai agora abrir o debate, a Ana, e é ela que passará agora a dirigir as perguntas que lhe forem feitas, ou que foram feitas à mesa.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having the opportunity of being with the two of us here. And my role here as a discussant is to start with provocations, and I have to raise, let's say, the elephant in the room. That is the increasing and rising conflict between Russia and the West, and not only on terrorism, as Ivan Timofeev related, and I'm going to support for a quote of one of these articles recently, saying that the two sides, Russia and the West, do not want and cannot listen to each other. I know that you have been positive and idealistic on saying you need to, we need a unity for action. But when I was listening to you, my first question is, how can we be united for action on terrorism if we even cannot agree on the object of terrorism? And we can call it ISIS, or we can call it Al-Qaeda, or whatever, or political insurgent movements, or opposition to the regime. The perception, and is my question on, for you to share with us, what is the Russia perspective on the definition of terrorism that could be agreed with the Atlantic Alliance, with the United Nations, because you recall the NATO Atlantic Council, the relations with the United States. I'm going to support from a Pew Research Center opinion poll that said on 38 countries and 40,000 people, so it's rather broad, that's 60% of what people define terrorism as a first threat. But around 30% defined US power and influence as a major security threat, Russia power and influence as a major security threat, and China power and influence as a major security threat. It's not only terrorism. And regarding Mary Kaldor's presentation, instead of defeating, we have a greater problem that is very similar with your arguments on new wars, the organized crime, the political goals, identity politics, etc. Here, I must ask, when you talk about the EU global strategy and the UN and African Union, who made these declarations are representatives of states. So why don't we see this implementation from states? It's because the states as we perceive them, political institutions as we perceive them, are not adequate to address these new wars, or is simply because they don't want? Because in the short term, we are talking for our domestic constituents. And he reinforced Vladimir Putin on the election, he reinforced Theresa May, it reinforced other political leaders internally. And here we have a huge difference between narratives, what we say, and what we do. And we are doing internally, and this is my last point of provocation on ideology. This is an extremism that have political objectives, all terrorism. We are talking about a huge polarization inside societies and nationalism. And all this is not directly related with terrorism, but also related with the reactions to this new crisis and recent crisis in our societies. So how can we be after Brexit? how could the Brexit internal British society react on this security level, and mainly how does United Kingdom will be, assuming that Brexit is going to happen? What is the position of internal British constituents and civil society regarding these topics? Because terrorism is a well-known phenomena in the United Kingdom, and all this question of political identity, etc., are being debated. And this is my provocations, and then we pass to the audience. Thank you very much.
Please. First.
You want me to start? Okay. So, I've often asked myself the same questions. Why is it that the knee-jerk reaction to a terrorist attack is an airstrike? And I think it is something that's built into the DNA of states. You know, states were constructed through war and through victories in war. And there's an assumption that their legitimacy, you know, we always have the military parades whenever we celebrate national days. There's this kind of assumption that when anything bad happens, we have to engage in a military attack. And of course, that's also, it's not just a historic thing, it's built into the military-industrial complex, the way the state is structured, and all of these kinds of factors. I actually think, and there's a sort of assumption that this is what the population expects. So politicians feel they have to react in this way because this is what the public expects. I actually think politicians are behind ordinary people. And I would give you actually the UK as an example. So so Jeremy Corbyn, who's the leader of the Labour Party, gave a speech, a rather brave speech, at Chatham House, which is our official international affairs centre, saying the war on terror doesn't work. We've had 17 years of the war on terror, and it's just produced more terrorism, and we need to think more carefully. We know that ISIS would never have happened without an inclusive government in Iraq. We know that it wouldn't have happened without a conflict in Syria. Shouldn't we be thinking about these things instead? About 2 weeks after this speech, the Manchester terrorist attack happened. And within a few days of the attack, he repeated these assertions. And of course, the government attacked him and said he's soft on terrorism, you know, he thinks we're responsible for terrorism. But actually, the majority of public opinion was on his side. And exactly the same thing happened over the Skripal attacks, the Salisbury attacks, where a nerve agent was used to poison these 2 Russian citizens. I didn't completely agree with his response on this one, but he argued that we need to bring in international machinery, that this is a crime, that we need to find the evidence first before we start geopolitical attacks on Russia. He was hugely attacked for it, but once again, the polls showed that the majority of British opinion agreed with him. So that's quite interesting as a sort of shift in public opinion that politicians aren't really aware of. Now, there's a huge problem relating to Brexit in this respect, because the security policy that's closest to the way Jeremy Corbyn talks is, of course, the security policy of the European Union, which is very, very different from the classic military policy of NATO. And here is Britain on the verge of leaving the European Union, and it's not clear where, you know, what will Britain's security policy be in a post-Brexit world.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to proceed with what Mary said. You mentioned terrorist attacks in Manchester last year, and I remember very well this day. I was in Vienna in OSCE conference on counterterrorism, And it was a high-level conference, and while we were together there, all the OSCE members, and we were really shocked by what happened in Manchester. And that was sort of an evidence for me addressing Anna's question that we are not doomed to be, discoordinated in this counter-terrorism effort. And technically speaking, the part of solution is a defragmentation of this problem. It's clear now that at some points these, disagreements are used in political games in a wider geopolitical context. But if we fragment the issue into concrete sub-issues, we will find a huge number of domains where we still cooperate and where cooperation is being developed. I would remind just a quick episode when at the end of 2017, one of the terrorist attacks in St. Petersburg, which is the second capital of Russia, the second biggest city of Russia, was prevented with the help of the US intelligence. In Russia, I mean, the terrorist attack was prevented by the information, with the help of information from the Americans. The problem is that it is not now a system, this cooperation, and we used to have this system after 9/11. Now it is more or less frozen, but at some points it still works. But you're right, pointing out on the wider context of our relations, and they are deteriorating. So we are now on another level of let's say, adversary, and I would use the term confrontation even. And Skripal case is quite an illustrative example, because if you look at the narrative on the narrative of official diplomacy, we will find two sides which do not, cannot, and wouldn't like to listen to each other. So these are two completely different narratives, people who are repeating their version with, very poor attempt to, let's say, to find some common understanding of what's going on. When I was recently discussing the issue with my EU colleagues, I asked a simple question. Imagine that tomorrow we will have another Salisbury, or 3 Salisburys at the same time in different European cities, or in Russian cities. What would we do? What leverage do we have in our hands? Should we expel more diplomats? Should we expel, drivers from the embassies, or cooks from the embassies' kitchens? So, what is the way out from this? If tomorrow we will have another provocation of similar kind, and I'm sure this is a provocation. I have no evidence, and I will not defend any version. As a scholar, I don't have enough data for this.
Can I say
yeah, of course. But we are very vulnerable on this. And last but not least, addressing Anna's question that we are spending more and more resources to contain each other. I mean, NATO and Russia. But if you look at the sources of threat, of what are the sources of people dying in the streets, in this, what Mary mentioned, of these lorries and of these random attacks, etc. These are not NATO in Russia and not Russia in Europe and the United States. So we are spending excessive resources, and our security does not increase. That's a huge challenge for us.
I do have a bit of a problem with that, because in the UK, over the last few years, there have been 14 suspicious murders of Russian oligarchs. Only one before this case, the Litvinov case, was properly investigated, and that was only because of a public outcry. The reason that none of these were investigated were geopolitical reasons. People were nervous about Russia. the reaction to this one is again not a criminal investigation, which is exactly what we should be doing, but rather a geopolitical tit for tat. So my answer is there should be serious criminal investigations. When we did, and I think the Litvinov criminal investigation was a very serious criminal investigation, it pointed the finger absolutely at the Kremlin. And although in this case, the Skripal case, this Novichok family of chemical weapons was developed in the Soviet Union, although we can't establish that this particular agent was made in Russia, because it's possible for different people to copy it. So many chemical warfare establishments might be developing the same agent. Nevertheless, I actually, on this case, agree with the government that the circumstantial evidence, given that they were former Russian intelligence, points to Russia. But I think what we have to do is a legal process, not a geopolitical process. And that's really what I mean by shifting from domestic approaches to international approaches. We really need to act according to law, both domestic and international. Of course, that raises other problems, which I'm happy to talk about, and which I've written extensively about what on earth is international law and what is happening to international law. But maybe I'll let Anna continue her questioning before I get into all of that.
Muito obrigado. A Ana vai fazer ainda, a Ana Santos Pinto vai fazer ainda umas perguntas e depois passava-se depois das respostas para a assistência.
When we look to and we hear your presentations, there are two kinds, and I think narratives here are very important. The way that we present reality and what is on the field. And we cannot deny what is happening. And decisions are geopolitical, and states have their own interests. And this is a question that I need to do when regarding your presentation and the question of criminal law and the approach of the EU. Can we still stand by a normative EU? Because nobody believes on that. And my thesis, my PhD thesis is on the EU political identity, so I'm crushing myself when I'm saying this. But when we go to the real world and we look to a world when the balance of power will be mainly United States, Russia, China, European powers does not have the same approach, can the EU and really do something on the global approach, even for their own member states? Because member states are not listening that. Again, for internal reasons, for national constituencies, for what they perceive and people perceive as an imperative. And this is very striking when we look to the European crisis. And if you can, Mary, I would like to ask you on this normative EU, that is basically the question of humanitarian law do not approach new wars as they should, and the question of human security, we still believe in those concepts, question mark. On Ivan, my last provocation is regarding Russia international approach on the present context, because you explain the question that what will happen if we have many of these cases either inside Russia or in other European countries. But we have a more immediate threat of a direct confrontation in the case of Syria, for example. And then your argument on rational theory probably could not be applied. And we are talking about nuclear powers. We are talking about governments that need to respond to some needs and some interests. And we have a President Putin that begin a new term with an economic problem, with a technological backwardness, and with a demographic problem. So is it sustainable for Russia to keep this international stand?
First. Well, You know, Anna, you mentioned that.
I'm just doing.
Yeah. I'm happy to address these questions. You mentioned that you defended your PhD on EU political identity, and quite many years ago, I did the same with the Russian political identity. So I understand very well your question, and let me eat a piece of a piece from the Mary's pie about these normative concepts. Well, I think that the problem is that more and more normative concepts are simulated. So we are in a postmodern age when we pronounce them, but they are becoming more and more empty. So it's a sort of simulation undermining the, let's say, the coordinates we have. That's one, by the way, one of the reasons of why radical Islamism has become so powerful. Because people who are switching to that side understand that values here are or perceive them as a simulation, and that's a challenge, of course. As for your question, I will start with Syria, and I would repeat once again what I have written recently, that we were in a very dangerous situation several weeks ago when there was another chemical provocation in Syria, and there was a strike of the US-led coalition. I would not give a normative assessment of this. I would give, let's say, an instrumental assessment that it was really dangerous. I wouldn't call it a Caribbean crisis, but we know that there were three scenarios provided to President Trump. One of these scenarios was implied the strike to Russian infrastructure. Maybe it implied that the Russians would not strike back according to rational theory, because the balance of power is quite skewed in favor to the US side. But in case of Russia, rational theory would not work. Yeah, and there was a risk of the direct military collusion there between Russians and Americans. I wouldn't overestimate my alarmism. I wouldn't say that the probability was high. And fortunately, militaries from both sides were the proponents of the careful policy. They maintained this hotline, red line, let's say, communicating with each other. But you know, the very tendency is very alarming. What if we have another provocation tomorrow? So what do we have a plan? What should we do? How should we settle out the issue? As for the Russian problems, you mentioned demography and technological backwardness and economy. All of them are there, so I would never deny that we have all of these problems. But these are not the problems of the new term of the president. These are the old problems which we have at least since Brezhnev's time. So it's a so strategic challenge that we need, in one way or another, to adopt a Chinese way of thinking on the long-term strategy, because all of this stuff cannot be overcome in one presidential term. It's just impossible. It cannot be settled out in five years or 6 years time. It requires a strategy for a century. It's inevitable. It will make us, Russians, to change our strategic culture, strategic thinking on the problems we have. And the key threat to our sovereignty is not the West and is not the military challenges, but our own technological and economic problems. If we don't solve these problems at home, we will be, in the long-term run, we will be vulnerable, and our sovereignty is, let's say, may suffer in the long perspective.
Yeah, normative Europe, but I'd like to say something first also about these military strikes, because they were just an example of what I'm talking about. The military strikes were a response to the use of chemical weapons in Ghouta, a suburb of Damascus. What did they achieve? They could not destroy the chemical stocks, because actually the chemical stocks had already, the declared chemical stocks had already been destroyed by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. It was very easy for Assad to keep a very small amount of these nerve gases and to hide them, enough to use them in Ghouta, and we have no idea whether those attacks would have destroyed them. But also what was used was chlorine on a wide scale, and chlorine is in widespread civilian use. There's no way you could bomb. So the strikes have not destroyed the chemical weapons. What they've done is to send a message to Assad that we don't mind if you bomb your civilians, you arrest them, you torture them. We only mind if you use chemical weapons. So it's been a completely useless, and it was done entirely to show domestic publics that we are reacting in some way. And nobody is kind of seriously thinking about what to do. And actually, I think that that's true of the Russians too, although the Russians are actually on the ground and have to think. But I just cannot understand why it is not possible to make a humanitarian agreement in Ghouta or in Idlib even more, where a new attack is likely to happen, between the Russians and the Americans, constraining Assad and allowing a UN presence in those areas. What? Yeah, but political dialogue at local levels. I mean, in Ghouta, it was actually local people that negotiated a ceasefire after the chemical weapons attack. They actually surrounded the house of a radical preacher who was trying to stop a ceasefire from happening, and they dragged him out by his beard. And they reached agreement. So it wasn't just the military pressure from the US, and those people need to be defended. Now they're vulnerable. The Russians are supposed to be patrolling, but the Russians have only 300 policemen for the whole of Syria. So you need a UN presence in there to protect the civilians, or an EU presence. So I just ask you that, because I think that's what needs to happen now. On normative Europe, it's one of my favorite subjects, so I could go on about it forever. But I think, first of all, normative is such a funny word, because every state would claim it was normative. You know, the US wouldn't say, I'm just pursuing my self-interest. The US would say, America has the most brilliant values, and we're exporting our values, not that this is in the US's self-interest. So I think the original author, Ian Manners, gave this rather interesting definition, that normative Europe is norm setting, in a way, establishing what is normal in international relations. And that's a very interesting idea. But I think if you think that norms do reflect your self-interest, then you come to the question of what is the European Union? And, you know, it's very important to understand that the European Union isn't a state in the making. It's not a classic international organization because it has more powers, but nor is it a superstate. It's something new, actually, that has been come about by accident. I describe it quite often as a model of global governance, but it's not completely there because there's no agreement, really, about what it is. But I think it's important to understand, if we're talking about self-interest, that the European Union is this new kind of animal that emerged, unlike states, in reaction to war rather than as a result of war. And the self-interest of the European Union is actually to live in a peaceful world. So it's to live in a law-governed world, because that's the way the European Union will survive. So in that sense, if we mean by normative Europe a political unit that's committed to a law-governed international order, then I think that if that's what normative Europe means, then I think that is what is involved in the European Union. The problem is that, of course, as we know, the European Union is both an intergovernmental organization, and the different nation states have very different conceptions. So I would argue that many of the smaller states, the Scandinavian states, the Iberian states, share this conception of what the European Union is, but the bigger states, particularly Big Britain and France, still have an old great power mentality. And some of the Central European states still have a nationalist mentality. So trying to shift that and to build the idea of a law-governed Europe and to mobilize popular support for that idea is incredibly important if the European Union is to survive, actually. And I think one of the ways that there can be, that support can be built, is if the European Union could play an effective role in places like Syria.
Muito obrigado. Eu pedia às pessoas que têm os microfones que se aproximassem. Vamos fazer o seguinte: quem quiser intervir, pede a palavra, diz o nome, por favor, e vamos fazer 3 intervenções de cada vez. As respostas serão depois em função disso. Faz favor, lá atrás, o nome, por favor, e depois a pergunta a quem se dirige, se é a Mary, ao Ivan ou à Ana.
Ora, o nome é Álvaro Ataíde, sou engenheiro aposentado e vim de Coimbra. Vou fazer a pergunta em português, espero que a tradução funcione. O subtítulo é Terrorismo e Disputas Estratégicas. E eu perguntava, faz sentido tratarmos o terrorismo como se fosse uma tempestade ou uma epidemia, ou faz sentido tratar o terrorismo como se fosse uma tática de guerra assimétrica? A pergunta é para o russo e para a inglesa.
Muito obrigado. Muito obrigado. Está aqui, aqui à frente, por favor. Só um segundo. Primeiro.
Eu também vou falar em português. E vou repetir a questão que foi posta: terrorismo e disputas estratégicas. Eu, sinceramente, julgo que nós estamos a analisar o epifenómeno de disputas estratégicas. Foi a destruição do Iraque, foi a destruição da Líbia e agora o que está a acontecer na Síria, que fez acelerar a importância de ações e movimentos terroristas. Portanto, nós não podemos isolar a análise do terrorismo sem falarmos do que é que se está a passar e que levou ao seu ressurgimento com a forma atual. Se olharmos para a Síria, e eu vou ser muito rápido, nós verificamos que temos um interesse objetivo e imediato do Irão, sem dúvida, que tem uma influência já estabelecida no Iraque, tem uma influência estabelecida na Síria, no Líbano e tem um papel importante no Iémen, como foi, aliás, aqui referido. Mas estamos também a falar da Turquia, que está interessada em evitar a formação de algum tipo de autonomia curda no norte do Iraque. E é isso que aproxima a Turquia do Irão, porque ambos estão interessados em evitar o surgimento ou o ressurgimento do nacionalismo curdo. Temos o interesse estratégico de Israel, que neste momento ocupa os Montes Golã, na Síria, e todos nós sabemos que Israel tem dado apoio militar à Al-Nusra e outros movimentos. E, inclusivamente, tem até intervido com a aviação de vez em quando. Temos, por outro lado, também o interesse, assim, um pouco mais longínquo, mas muito importante, da Arábia Saudita, que o que faz é armar-se, provavelmente para implodir. Portanto, o meu ponto é o que nós estamos na minha opinião, uma grande parte do terrorismo que neste momento nós estamos a tratar tem a ver com algo que se passa a montante e se continua a passar, que são disputas por potências regionais apoiadas por potências europeias, neste caso concreto França e Reino Unido, no caso da Líbia, por exemplo, e no caso da Síria, e pelos Estados Unidos da América, que neste momento não sabem muito bem o que fazer, como aliás disse o nosso primeiro convidado esta manhã. Eu calo-me por aqui só para dizer que a relação da ligação entre aqueles dois aspectos é que um não pode ser discutido hoje sem que o outro seja discutido em simultâneo. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Estava ali um... Faz favor.
Boa tarde, Bernardo Ivo Cruz, da University of Bristol. Eu gostava de voltar um bocadinho ao normativo europeu para perguntar se o modelo de condicionalismo democrático que foi usado na transição da Europa de Leste para os mecanismos ocidentais é o tipo de atividade e de ação externa que a União Europeia deve, sente-se confortável e deve fazer, principalmente quando nós podemos comparar o resultado final da condicionalidade democrática com o resultado final do regime change, que foi outra metodologia utilizada mais ou menos na mesma altura para o desenvolvimento de democracias. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Só para ter uma ideia do tempo, mais alguém a seguir deseja tomar a palavra? Só para ter ideia. Portanto, 2 pessoas, não é? São 3 pessoas. Portanto, vão-se responder agora a estas questões e a seguir dava a palavra aos 3 inscritos agora. Mary, please.
It's about political conditionality from European Union, the democratic conditionality comparing with the regime change, both models of approach to cooperation.
That's a good question.
Quickly, because of the time.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
So, very good question. Is terrorism an epidemic or a tactic of asymmetric war? I mean, I think if by terrorism we mean the use of force to spread terror, and we mean the use of force against civilians, then it's not only being used, it's the typical tactic in new wars. There are very few battles between armed groups in contemporary wars. Most of the violence is directed against civilians. It's usually aimed at forced displacement as a way of gaining political control. So that's terrorism. Bombing is terrorism. Bombing of schools and hospitals is terrorism. So I think this, and I think as was made clear in the talk by Timofeev, the whole idea of the war on terror has allowed regimes to claim that attacks on civilians, attacks on anybody they don't like, can be dubbed attacks on terrorism. So, you know, the war on terror is not a war against another state, it's the war of the manhunt. It's a war against individuals. And that's what makes it so insidious and dangerous. And of course, I very much agree with Fernando. Maybe I didn't make it clear enough, but that's what I meant by saying the war on terror was so dangerous in Syria. At my last count, there are no less than 81 countries military intervening in Syria. Syria has become a free-for-all internationally. There are 78 members of the global coalition against ISIS. Then you add Russia, Iran, and Israel, who are not members, and that makes 81. 82. 82. It's just unbelievable. And so it isn't surprising if it provokes terrorism. And of course, in Syria, what you saw, I think it's very important for people to understand this point because it relates to everything I've been saying about politics. The vast majority of people demonstrating in the Arab Spring in Syria, and this is also true of the people who demonstrated for democracy in Ukraine, it's also true of the people who demonstrated for democracy in Bosnia, were against the turn to violence. they felt they could never defeat Assad if it became violent, because he was so much stronger than them. They could only defeat Assad through the appeal to conscience. What happened actually was groups of military entrepreneurs who wanted to create chaos mobilized poor, unemployed young men from the countryside. In the case of Syria, they were very often Gulf donors with extremist Islamic ideas. And that became the opposition, which has very little to do with democracy. But I think what is important to say is to remember that those people who took part in the protest movements became civil society. They started to organize at local levels, they tried to do local mediation, they provided humanitarian support to victims, and those people need to be the partners of the international community in trying to solve the problems of places like Syria and elsewhere. I won't go on because I know, but just on political conditionality, because it allows me to make the last point, which I think is very important. I do think that the East European countries got independence at a moment when neoliberalism was in full flow. And the kind of neoliberalism of the political conditions that were imposed on Eastern Europe, I believe, has led to the situation we see today, that all of the social safety nets were dismantled. People in Eastern Europe said, at least under communism, we had bread. If you look at infant mortality, life expectancy, they all fell as a consequence of this. Now, the European Union is shifting, and if you look at somewhere like Ukraine, political conditionality that relates to transparency, dealing with corruption is actually very, very important and something that's really supported by people in Ukraine. But I do think all the conflicts that I follow, they always started with the combination of an authoritarian regime opening up to the world, both politically and economically, through liberalization policies. And what you see happening, again, to take Syria as an example, is that in the few years that preceded the outbreak of the war, you got a rise of unemployment, particularly in the countryside, a rise of poverty, a loss of social services. The same was true of Bosnia. So I think that kind of political conditionality has been very dangerous.
Two very brief sentences. Well, the first one is on terrorism as a tactics or a virus. I would approach terrorism as a technique, but ideologies which stand behind as a virus, and especially the one of radical Islamism, which is a key challenge for conventional Islam, for traditional Islam, peaceful Islam. The reaction on the question on European norms, I asked a question to one of my friends who is dealing with Africa, why China is so popular in Africa. And his answer was, China is so popular because they bring infrastructure and others bring trainings on values. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. As três pessoas que estão inscritas, por favor. Nuno, Carlos e Lata. Faz favor. Eu agradecia que fossem perguntas muito diretas por causa do tempo, não levem a mal.
Bruno Cardoso Reis, do Centro de Estudos Internacionais do ISCTE. I'll shift to English to make it quicker. So on Russia, you said, Ivan, that there were differences, and also that Russia basically wanted good relations with the West, wanted to fight terrorism. I was wondering, is there any kind of criticism in Russia, self-criticism, about interference in the US elections, all this strange epidemic of people being killed Russians being killed in the UK, support for Assad? Do you think any of that has any kind of role in the tension with the West? And to Mary, I have a lot of sympathy with I think, your ideals and also some sympathy with some of your criticisms. But how can you defeat ISIS' attempt to create a terrible totalitarian state in the middle of the Middle East without using military means and causing civilian casualties? Yes, very often the military is not a solution, or is not the only solution, or is not the main solution, but sometimes I think it's pretty much inevitable. And I'm also not sure that to say, well, most of these actors, terrible actors, are not political is the right way to address it. I mean, ISIS had a very political objective to create a state. Or to say that if you have an international, multilateral solution, a very comprehensive solution with the EU, that will necessarily work better or dispense the need for the military, because you cannot have development and all these other nice things if you don't have security in this context of terrible crisis. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Faz favor. Estava... Sim. Aqui depois lá atrás, por favor.
O meu nome é Eduardo Correia de Matos. Eu esperava que se falasse mais de terrorismo nesta sessão. Eu acho que se falou relativamente pouco. E deixou-se um pouco uma sensação de o terrorismo ser uma coisa nova. O terrorismo sempre existiu e provavelmente sempre existirá, porque o terrorismo é apenas uma tática de conquistar poder. Quando um pequeno grupo ou um pequeno país tem grandes ambições, a maneira mais fácil e mais rápida de conquistar poder é através das técnicas terroristas. Sempre foi assim e esperemos que não continue, mas é duvidoso que não continue a ser. Portanto, o que eu acho que há de novo no terrorismo são duas coisas. Uma que nos afeta a nós todos. Pela primeira vez, o mundo desenvolvido, ocidental e não ocidental, foi alvo de ataques terroristas vindos de fora. Porque o nosso século XIX e XX é cheio de ataques terroristas, mas eram feitos por gente da casa. Pela primeira vez, os ataques terroristas passaram a ser feitos de fora. E isso deixou-nos muito nervosos. Essa é uma grande mudança. A outra grande mudança, e que eu acho que gerou aqui muita confusão entre terrorismo e guerra civil, é que o terrorismo de antes era uma coisa organizada. Havia um grupo que fazia terrorismo, um de cada vez. E as guerras civis também eram uma coisa organizada. Nós tivemos a Guerra Civil de Espanha aqui ao lado e tinha os vermelhos e os negros e basicamente era isto. Hoje as guerras civis o que nos estão a mostrar, onde houver um vazio de poder, vai haver um enxame de grupos terroristas. E onde houver um enxame de grupos terroristas, qualquer guerra civil se torna uma coisa muito complicada de gerir. Portanto, era só este apontamento que gostava de ouvir qualquer coisa.
Muito obrigado. Faz favor.
Posso? Muito boa tarde, o meu nome é Carlos Branco. A minha pergunta é dirigida à professora Mary Kaldor, que afirmou a necessidade de trazer o presidente Assad à mesa das negociações. É uma ideia que eu naturalmente tenho simpatia. A minha pergunta é saber quais são os interlocutores nesse processo negocial. Se está a pensar no exército islâmico, se está a pensar na Al-Nusra, ou está a pensar, quem é que está a pensar exatamente que serão os interlocutores desse processo negocial? Porque, de facto, estes grupos que estão, ou estiveram e ainda estão alguns, em Duma e em Guta, são grupos jihadistas, são grupos de mujahidins, é assim que eles se afirmam. É fundamental, então, neste processo, perceber, e eu gostaria de saber, quem são os interlocutores desse processo. Porque, segundo afirmou, não se negocia com terroristas. Sendo estes grupos terroristas, afinal, em que é que ficamos? Portanto, parece-me haver aqui alguma contradição que necessita de ser esclarecida, ou pelo menos eu gostaria de saber qual era a sua resposta a esta questão. Porque, por um lado, se de facto existem, quem são, se puder partilhar connosco, os grupos moderados que combatem na Síria e que poderão participar neste processo negocial. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Eu ia dar a palavra primeiro ao Ivan, depois à Mary e terminava com a Ana.
Well, thank you. I will be very brief. And the first question was on the perceptions in the Russian public on the so-called collusion with US electoral campaign. You know that the Russian public tend to perceive this as a very absurdist thing, as a sort of a political anecdote. Similar, I would like to abstain from normative assessments. But you know, the peculiarity of the Russian public is that when it perceives something as a theater of absurd, one of the indicators is the appearance of anecdotes. Who makes anecdotes? Who are the authors of anecdotes? Well, people. Yeah, and anecdotes is a production of the spirit of perception. And one of my hobbies is a collection of anecdotes. I love them. So I can tell you at least 10 anecdotes about Skripal's case. It's an awful thing in political relations. It's a tragedy and it's a disaster. But if we approach to the public opinion and the public spirit, it is perceived as a theater of absurd, really. But being critical to ourselves, I think that what we could do from the Russian side is to change a different language of dealing with the issues, taking into account the vulnerability of the international climate now, taking into account that it's like a dry forest now when every small fire can lead to a big fire. I think that what we could do and what we should do is to change our language in communication, to make it more sensitive to the problems which are really huge for the British society or American society. The problem of interference to elections is a very sensitive topic for Americans. It's a part of their internal political life. So, in a sense, the sensitivity from our side is very much required.
Let me say first, I'm sorry, I don't want to say that I'm against military means. I'm against the kind of military means we adopt. And the kind of military means that we adopt are typically airstrikes combined with empowering armed groups on the ground. That's what we did in Libya. That's what we did against ISIS. In Libya, the result has been chaos among the armed groups. In Syria and Iraq, the result has been huge levels of civilian casualties, great deal of destruction, and empowering Kurdish militias and the like. And now we've got a war between the Kurdish militias and the Turks. So I'm against that kind of. But I think, obviously, you will have to use force of some kind. And I think we will have to develop new ways of using force that are more like policing than like warfighting, that are about trying to protect people and arrest criminals and terrorists rather than trying to do a military defeat of criminals. And there are all kinds of techniques which have been developed. Using safe havens, creating areas which you defend, which allow people to come to, using humanitarian corridors, these kinds of things. So that's the kind of way I would favor the use of force. But absolutely key is political legitimacy. I mean, you can't solve the problem of ISIS unless Sunnis are really involved in the Iraqi government. That's the starting point. Then you can do policing. But policing only works if you have a legitimate authority. And similarly in Syria, where, these were ungoverned areas that ISIS moved into, and they were ungoverned because of the conflict. And if you hadn't had the conflict, it would never have happened. So solving the conflict is a key part. There was a question about terrorists, which I've completely forgotten what it was. Oh, terrorists have always been here. Yes, but I think this lot of terrorists, there's something different about them because they're globally networked. They use different techniques. So yes, of course, there's always been terrorists, but I think they're different. And then finally, yeah, I'm very aware of the time. Finally, on Assad, I didn't suggest negotiating with Assad. We've been negotiating with Assad and a sort of motley collection of opposition for 7 years, and the talks have gone absolutely nowhere. What I want is Russian support for a UN humanitarian intervention. That's what I want. If the Russians were on side, it wouldn't be so difficult to get everybody else on side. And what that would mean would be supporting locally negotiated ceasefires. There have been something like 44 over the last year, and really putting in a UN presence that protects the civilians both from the regimes and tries to keep the Islamist groups out of the area. That's my model. And I think it's perfectly feasible if we got Russians on board. Maybe we'd have a problem with Iran, but I think that's the key.
Muito obrigado. Como a Ana prescinde de fazer qualquer intervenção final, queria agradecer muito à Mary, ao Ivan e naturalmente à Ana. Vamos fazer agora um breve intervalo e começará a seguir outro painel. Muito obrigado por tudo.